So, you plan to buy an Intel Arc B580 since you heard it was a good budget GPU that even outperforms the RTX 4060, plus it even has a 12GB VRAM to support for future gaming titles. Well, you have a good taste, my friend, but before checking out, you must be aware that this GPU has a big problem and you might not get to experience the performance you were expecting. So watch this until the end to know if your system is ready to max out this graphic card's performance. So, what is the issue with Intel Arc B580? Well, it has a CPU overhead issue. What is that? Well, it means that the B580 requires a strong CPU performance to maximize its full potential. When using older CPUs, the performance of B580 drops off very strongly. Very simply, the B580 is faster when using the new Ryzen 7 9800X3D, but it becomes so weak and slower, even slower than the 4060 once you use it with an R5 5600, whereas the 460 performs the same with either CPU in most cases. Since the whole advantage of Arc is the low price, the fact that you need a modern CPU to take advantage of the performance is brutal. It almost makes the cards worthless for budget gamers. But that's not all. The B580 also have a massive performance drop when your system does not support resizable bar. Resizable bar was supported through Intel 10th generation and Ryzen 3rd generation, but some got it to work down to Skylake or Ivy Bridge with some BIOS updates or modifications. Nonetheless, if you have lower CPU than the 10th gen and the Ryzen 3, you will have very significant performance drops because of the overhead issue. The upside is that it won't always be a problem, not unless a game is very CPU demanding. So most likely it won't cause a bunch of games, especially those released in the last decade. But since games are getting more CPU demanding over time, it will eventually show up more. So, how much performance loss are we really gonna see when using a lower end system on the B580? Well, let's take a good look at the graphs. This first set of graphs are from hardware Canucks, as he tested how much performance loss would having a Ryzen 9800X3D run an Intel B580 versus a B580 paired with an Intel i5 9600K. So here's Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 at 1080p native resolution scaling with no upscaling and at TAA. So the B580 paired with 900X3D ran at 74 FPS and a 65 1% low, which is running very stable. Well, when it was paired with a 9600K, it went down to 52 FPS with a 47 FPS 1% low. That was a huge margin of loss there. But the RTX 468GB ran 89 FPS with the 9800X3D, but it only went down to 80 FPS when it was run with the 9600K. So there was no huge performance loss, unlike the B580 where it has a massive drop in performance. On to our next game, which is Hogwarts Legacy, and it again has a massive FPS drop when pairing the 580 with the 9600K. From the 77 FPS average, it became 52 FPS average, while as we can see with the trend with the 4060, it only went from 77 FPS down to 68 FPS. So this is showing that Nvidia doesn't have these huge overhead problems unlike the B580. But the game that really shows the problem that this has is SpiderMan Remastered. SpiderMan Remastered ran at 154 FPS. With a 9900X3D, it went down to 73 FPS with the 9600K. It's actually performing worse than a 1660 Super 6GB in this graph. This just shows that if a game is CPU dependent, then the B580 will perform very worse than what it should have been if you pair it with a good modern CPU. So what would be the minimum CPU you should have just to run the B580 without any problems? Well, we can answer that by checking the graphs from Hardware Unboxed, where he tested 6 CPU across generations to see how much performance impact does each generation of CPU does to the B580, and what I can say, it was very bad. So here's the first graph. It's Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 at 1080p Ultra Native DLAA 4K texture pack. So as we can see, our CPUs are 2600, Ryzen 5 3600, 5600, 5700 X3D, 7600, and the 9800 X3D. In this graph, we will see that the first CPU that has some huge margin of impact was 57X3D. From 62 FPS, it went down to 56, and its 1% loss went from 53 to 48. They're showing that even the 5700X3D is being affected by the CPU overhead, which we haven't seen much of this issue with NVIDIA cards. Because as you can see, the RTX 4060 is performing the same across multiple generations up until the Ryzen 5 5600. Now, when we go down to the Ryzen 5 5600, the Intel Arc B580 is performing at 53 FPS from the 62 FPS it had when it was running with the 800X3D, and its 1% loss is at 45 FPS. But if we go down lower, it performs even way worse, and the Ryzen 5 2600 can't even run it at a decent performance anymore. Now, if you're gonna check Marvel's Spider-Man, which is the game that's usually affected by this problem, the B580 ran at 152 FPS with the 105 FPS lows with the 9800X3D. And when we went down to Ryzen 5 7600, we can see that there's already a huge performance loss just by moving from an X3D chip to regular Ryzen 5 AM5 series chip. From 152 it went to 114, while the B580 is having huge losses as we go down generation per generation, with the 5600 running at half of the performance it should have been with the 9800X3D, and that is very bad since all budget gamers usually build their PC with the Ryzen 5 5600. But as we can see with the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4060, across the board, it has very decent performance up until the 57X3D and having a minimal loss at Ryzen 5 5600. So what does this all mean? This means in order to have the B580 perform without any performance drops, you need to have a high-end CPU. That said, the least I would recommend is that you should have a Ryzen 5700X3D so you wouldn't have that much of an impact because of the CPU headroom problem. I get it that people usually upgrade the CPU every 3 generations, but having huge performance losses on the Ryzen 5600 is really crazy, as we don't get to see that on an NVIDIA graphic card. But the B580 drops its frames to half of what it should have performed when using a higher end CPU shows that this is really a huge deal. Marketing it as a budget upgrade GPU isn't favoring Intel either, since this will have budget builders buy this GPU expecting great performance but finding that their GPU is performing the same as their GTX 1660 Super. So, should you buy the B580? Well, if you're an AM5 or you have an i5 13400 above, then I would say that you can buy this budget GPU. It performs well and has a 12GB VRAM that should perform well on compatible systems. But if you're on older hardware like a Ryzen 5600 and below, I would suggest to stay away from it. The minimum I would recommend this GPU on is on a Ryzen 5700X3D, while even that has some performance hit. But if you plan to buy a GPU now and plan to upgrade the rest of your system in the future, then this is still a good buy for its price. While you wait on your funds to get a new system, this will still play either the same or even better than a 4060 depending on the game. So, will you buy a B580? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and see you on our next video for more awesome tech and gaming content.